We're talking about what actually happened to Indigenous people in Canada. This is like part 8, I think, at this point. You can go back to learn about the Indian Act. Now, what I want to say moving forward, okay, and there has been people who have commented this, other Indigenous people who have commented this is very whitewashed. What I am reciting to you, it's a course, okay? The person who like made the course, the lead is Métis, and then the 3 presenters, I believe, they said that they're Indigenous from different nations. But what I want you to keep in mind is that this is written by a university, and it took a long time for the Canadian government to even acknowledge what was happening at residential schools. And that wasn't that long ago. Last one closed in 96. So when we're having conversations about the history, something that I've noticed in here, and I don't know if it's going to change as I go through the history, like as I continue the course, is that they're talking about how harmonious all of these relationships were, which just knowing what I know, because I've seen clips of settlers' journals and the fact that they were intentionally giving Indigenous people blankets that had been infested by people who had smallpox, and then having this course kind of just say that they just got along, they were good, they were partners, and the amount of Indigenous people who died during that time due to disease. And not only that, but there is a large history of them treating the Indigenous people in the United States differently. And they say in this course that difference is due to the fact that they needed the Indigenous people in Canada to help them survive. So let's jump into it. I hate history. I'm gonna try my best to make it not like history in high school. So we had our French settlers in here, okay? And there was 2 nations that helped the French, and they acted as a middleman. So basically the French people were here, and then there was 2 groups of people that would help trade with all of the Indigenous that lived over here. So these Indigenous people didn't really have to interact with the settlers, but I'm just going to refer to them as settlers. They were French. The distinction between French and English becomes important later, but for right now, just settlers. So they were basically helping them get their goods out here, and the French were getting what they wanted, which was beaver pelts. It mentioned that some Dutch arrived further south and they began to rival the French, but then it didn't touch much on it. See, okay, so there was the League of 5 Nations Confederacy, okay? That's the whitewash. 5 Nations Confederacy. Mohawk, Onalda, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. So 5 nations working together. Then the French, instead of using the 2, started to use 1. They kind of fell apart, and then the French moved up into here, which paved the way for the Hudson's Bay Company. Yes, the one you're thinking of. Yes, the one that's going bankrupt. That company we have problems with. We have beef. They caused a lot of issues, but that paved the way for the Hudson's Bay to come in. So the Hudson's Bay was wealthy English merchants, and in 1670 the king granted them title to Rupert's Land. This is Rupert's Land. Basically, the English government just decided to give them all of that land, a third of Canada. And they didn't really consult anybody about this, they just decided it was theirs. But they did not have any inland posts until 1770. This becomes important to remember because this becomes conversations around treaties, specifically in this area, like that would be like Saskatchewan, Alberta. So the French was focused on the interiors until the Treaty of Paris. So wars over in Europe affect Canada, right? Because it was the French and Europe's. Hudson's Bay, that whole area, that King's Landing, or Rupert's Landing, was given by the English government, regardless of the fact that the French, right? You see they clash. So traders from Montreal formed together the Northwest Company, mostly male workers, and they became known as the Nor'westers. The French were a little bit better than the Europeans. So the French adopted Indigenous trading practices and kingship ties, which is basically like getting along through marriage. And the Hudson Bay didn't like this and called the children half-breeds or mixed bloods. The French called them bois brûlés or métis. So that's where Métis comes from. Is a specific group of people that married and had children with the French settlers. They're considered an Indigenous people, but they are post-contact people. So this group did not technically exist until the French settled and they mixed together a lot. And this was in Western Canada. Okay, and then we jump into pemmican. Pemmican is important because pemmican was made from buffaloes, okay? Buffaloes, so the dried fat, meat, plus berries. It was basically 2,000 to 3,000 calories per bar. So it was important because it helped all of the settlers who didn't know how to like properly hunt fish, right? The Indigenous basically would deal pemmican to the settlers. And it was mostly made by women. And in 1821, Métis were the dominant makers of pemmican. So that group of land that we saw that the Hudson's Bay Company owned, in 1811, they sold 74 million acres to Thomas Douglas. This was known as the Selkirk Settlement, which was in the Red River Valley, which is where there was a lot of Métis. They wanted a place for displaced Irish immigrants, and they decided this was the place. Settlers did not recognize Métis' claim to the land. The Nor'westers and the Métis joined together to become partners, struggling against the Hudson's Bay Company. In 1814, that area, so that Selkirk, got a governor named first governor, Miles MacDonald. He made a proclamation called the Pemmican Proclamation. He issued a ban on the export of pemmican or any other provisions. Basically was like, I don't want you guys to be making money. I don't want you guys to do this anymore. Obviously, they were pissed because they depended on the sale and like trading of pemmican. Then, to make things harder, 6 months later, and it's quoted that he did this just to be a dick, just to control people. 6 months later, he banned running or use of horses on buffalo hunts. And this is when the Métis began to resist. Basically, he just made it impossible for them to hunt, and then also impossible for them to sell. There was the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, which led to the death of 21 colonists and became costly for both the Nor'westers and the Hudson's Bay Company. So due to political legal pressures, colonial pressures, and economic costs forced the companies to merge in 1821. Then they say there was stability, a reasonable stability for the next 50 years. The value of furs went up, value of goods declined, and there was an incentive to overtrap, meaning like beavers and things like that. They were overtrapping, killing too many of them, and the population was decreasing, which they came here because they already did that in Europe. Because of this decline, in order to maintain profitability, they traded alcohol. In 1821, there was resource shortages and the trade in alcohol declined. In the 1850s, the bison population declined due to overharvesting. And then you had a group of people who, basically, they were free men. They were people who are their own bosses, essentially entrepreneurs, left and lived outside of the authority of their bands. Again, the whitewashing of this information, where there's a photo of them. It was specifically the United States government encouraged the unaliving of a lot of buffalo. Until the buffalo, their goal was to exterminate them because Indigenous people use them. Millions of buffalo. They took the population of buffalo from, I believe it was a bison, from 30 million down to 1,000. This is again that interweaving of Canada and the United States when it comes to Indigenous people. They were different, but they were the same, if that makes sense. They were way worse in the United States by intentionally, like there's a photo of just bones of bison. But here it was through policy. And in the 1800s, beavers were almost extinct as well. 1879 is the end of the Plains buffalo economy because they were down to that 1,000. And life started to change for Indigenous people because there was more disease outbreaks, and they started to have settlements closer to the outposts. And in the 1600s, one epidemic on the West Coast caused 20,000 Indigenous people to be unalived, or a third of their population.